how can architectural changes to the system, be it organization or enable or unlock capacity to deliver more value. And specifically, maybe follow-up question or in context of like how can sense making and empathy shape the dynamics of the organizational systems. So I guess two-part question. One is how can organizational structural changes or systemic changes change the underlying team dynamics or social dynamic? And then in context of that, how can tools like sense making and practicing empathy or perspective taking can help with this? So who wants to start with that or answer part one or part two of that question?
Well, you called Dave with the magical word sense making. So, I mean, you rub the genie's lamp.
Yeah, the trouble is, I know I fundamentally disagree with Derek on nearly everything he talks about. So I'm resisting the temptation to go over systems thinking and its problems. Yeah. Um, I think if we're talking about architecture, you need to understand what you can actually manage and what you can't manage. And that's one of the most fundamental lessons of complexity theory. So there are kind of like only two things you can actually change, really. One is who are what we call them actants, which means they can be people or constraints or constructors or whatever. So there are things in a system which are actually having some impact on it, and they have some level of agency, even if it's not conscious. And so you can change those. You can change how they interact, and the more local the interactions, the richer they are, the more effective they are. So those are kind of like the only things you can change. You've then got to do other things because changing that will trigger what I call emergent properties of the system. So things will start to merge, and you can't fully predict them from either the interactions or the agents themselves. Yeah, and that means you need to create, as part of your architecture, what are called human sensor networks. So you need to get people from multiple backgrounds to scan what's going on in real time. 17% of radiologists see a gorilla picture of a gorilla in an X-ray, 83% don't. So you've got to find the 17%. And then the other key aspect of architecture is you create scaffolding, which are highly structured systems. In the UK, we drive on the left, Germany, they drive on the right. We increase the Crane's level to which we get total predictability. Now, in none of that do we talk about individual behavior. And you won't find anybody who understands complexity science or the cognitive neuroscience talking about defining behaviors, because behaviors are themselves emergent properties of interactions over time. And there's lots of things we do know. For example, crews as team functions, can handle massive cognitive load, whereas individuals can't. We know that ritual is an important part of human decision making. So from my point of view, architecture is about creating the structures from which things will emerge and creating the structures to monitor for early emergence so you can reinforce good things and disrupt bad things, and stop talking about how things should be, because it's a total waste of everybody's effort.
Okay. I have a follow-up maybe question to that, but I'll let others maybe share their thoughts before I do that.
We can take part two about the empathy since that's my area of specialty. So I think, my background is applying, leading organizations who specialize in modernizing really complex legacy systems. And one of the best ways that we were able to do that was absolutely finding the right structures and, the right flexibility, but also making sure that those human to human interactions are as efficient as possible. And that's what empathy enables us as humans to do. And I think it's really important to define what empathy is. There's a lot of different, things out there. The work that most influences me is John City. He has the fundamental empathy architecture, functional empathy system architecture. So it's interesting to go back and read his research because he's like, we should decompose empathy as a construct from a monolithic concept. And I was like, oh, this sounds familiar. So he breaks empathy down into four components. There is regulation, which is our ability to calm down our emotions, but also our physical selves. There is emotion sharing. So, noticing, whether or not you're activated and whether or not that's kind of a negative feeling or positive feeling. There's also cognitive. So that's the perspective taking. And then finally, there's motivation, which is commonly called empathic concern or compassion, right? And that's the noticing somebody wants to, like, is suffering and you want to do something about it. And when we can balance all four things, then we can really optimize our human to human interaction. So I'll give you a quick example of, seeing this on a team. I worked with, a group, and there was a test engineer who was just really frustrated because their developer that they were working with, he would pass off these really, really detailed reports, and then the developer never, implemented them correctly. There were always bugs. And so we can look at it on the systems lens, and yes, okay, there's some problems there because we're doing hot potato, past potato. That's, that's not the best way to do that. But in terms of optimizing the interactions, once we applied empathy, he could see that the situation is that the developer had ADHD and a very demanding boss. And the way that he was presenting his information was incredibly dense prose. And then he came to the realization through several exercises that he was actually doing this in a defensive mechanism because he wanted to show, like, hey, I've covered my butt. Look at me. I have all these details here. And so once the empathy and the compassion unlocked, he's like, oh my gosh, I am making this guy's life so much harder. He immediately came up with the idea of, what if I did a video instead? And then he would have more contextual information. I could timestamp it. It would be less, less burden for me to produce. And it strengthened the relationship. So these are what I call pebble problems, right? They're the local interactions. They're the tiny friction points that happen all the time. They're frustrating, they're annoying, and they get in the way. So when we learn to optimize those, what I found is that empathy on the technical level, when we really understand it, that is our best tool for being able to optimize those relationships, which then, generates things up more emergently.
Yeah.
I'll throw in something just for fun. I was scribbling down some words, listening to Dave and then to Andrea, and reflecting on some of the earlier speakers today. A lot of what I talk about, and Dave, when he pops back in, he's obviously on a flaky connection, but is about context and about attitudinal issues and about the interactions between the agents in the system. So the people, the technologies, the machines, the processes, everything within the system. But the other thing is, when we talk about incentives, what's the incentive for people to actually change? We all can consider ourselves change makers and purveyors of change. And whether we're selling a methodology, selling an approach, coaching something, we're all sort of in this change business. But I work with a lot of organizations, very fortunate to work with some very large organizations in the USA. And I've got executives who have, 5 to 10,000 people in their organization, terrified of making decisions because of the people even above them at very, very senior level, whatever you want to call them, at these sort of, global conglomerate sort of steering committees, are afraid to make decisions because they're worried about their position. So we have a lot more within the environment, a lot more within these organizations than just throwing methodologies or saying that, if we just use, I don't know, whether it's team topologies or another approach, scaled agile or something else, it will solve all these problems. No, it won't. Because we first of all have to remember, I'm a lean guy, Toyota guy through and through. So I always preach customer first as the message. But the reality is most of these organizations are predicated on making money, getting greater power, greater control, greater control of the market, greater profit for the wares that they're selling. They're not out there actually to make the world a better place. Very few of them exist and if we think they do, then I think we're delusional. And so once we start to understand some of these things, and yes, when we get people in a room for 2 days or a day, and 30 or 40 people in a room, we preach some of the good stuff that we preach. We inspire them. They're all yahooing and chest bumping and fist bumping and stuff with each other, and all excited about this. But then they go back to the real world, and they have no power to make any sizable change. I've been working with a client recently from a continuous improvement point of view and talking about the 1% changes, the 1% Kaizen, making these small nudges, small changes in the system. And yes, that does bring some improvement. But if you want to make true systemic change in an organization, we first have to ask ourselves, why does the organization need to change? Do they have a compelling reason to change? Is there something that's threatening their survival? And will they listen to the message we're preaching? And then the people that we're preaching to, do they have the actual ability to make the change? We may be right, they may be right, but they have no ability to make the change. And then, as I say, context is key. I mean, it's all right talking about lots of methods and approaches and various different things, but unless you truly understand the context of the environment you're in, then throwing tools at it is going to be fruitless. And that brings us sort of a segue back to sense making, because that's the technique and the art form of understanding the environment we're in and the behaviors within that environment, and starting to understand how we could potentially nudge the system in the right direction. I'll stop at that. Andrea's frowning at me now. I'm just Dave.
No, that's my focus face. I'm not upset.
Nigel said something very important there, all right? And he pointed out, if you get people into a workshop or you get them on a leadership training course, they will agree to anything. And the more platitudinous it is, the easier it is for them to agree to it. We can all agree we want to be servant leaders. One of the most meaningless terms to ever come out of the Agile movement, because it's very context specific. And the danger is, in workshops, people will agree to everything, but you're not changing things on a substantial basis. I think the other important thing from what Nigel said, if you're managing 10,000 people, empathy has got to be an emergent property of distributed interactions. It can't be defined up front. And empathy is one of a series of emotions that people will actually display because they're part of evolutionary history. If you increase proximity, you reduce numbers, you reduce power. And I think, the work we're doing on peace and reconciliation, for example, is to bring people together from different political backgrounds, but not to say you need to show empathy for each other, but put them in a situation where they're working on something they agree is a common project, not talk about their differences, and allow empathy to be an unspoken element of how they decide to have a different conversation. So I think there are a couple of main problems you see in agile thinking, which inherits from North Atlantic thinking. One is the assumption the individual is the prime unit of analysis, which it isn't. We're mostly defined by our interactions. The second is the assumption you can define up front what behaviors are desirable, which you can't. And even if you could, you shouldn't. Yeah. And I think the third one, and really the most substantial one, is not recognizing that you can't define an ideal future state. If you define an ideal future state, the worst thing you can do in a modern organization is announce a transformation program or announce a change program. Because all you'll do is trigger thousands of memories of how they've failed in the past. And that's how people will filter the data. We need to start to do things bottom up. Yeah. And we need to respond to changes as they're beneficial by giving them more resources, and disrupt changes which are non-beneficial by giving them less. And business architecture has to reflect that reality rather than these idealistic future state nonsense.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think one thing is that's emerging from the latest empathy research. Helen Reese is a great researcher who wrote the book, The Empathy Effect. She talks about how empathy is a capacity. And I like that metaphor because it's our capacity to be able to sit with somebody who's different than us and collaborate. And, if I'm exhausted, if I'm tired, Jamil Zaki has the motivated theory of empathy. So it brings back to, what Nigel and Dave are saying, is that it's the motivation to be able to work with somebody who is different from us, but we're not always in that state. So empathy isn't necessarily, it's an emotion, but it's that ability, like, are we regulated? Are we acting out of compassion and concern? Are we able to emotion share? Are we able to consider somebody else's perspective? And that's not yes all the time. So creating the conditions where those interactions are likely to occur, and increasing the capacity of empathy, not just in the individual, but also in the system. So creating the space, making sure we don't have a culture of urgency. So many different things can contribute to that. I want to make sure we make space for Ian. I haven't heard his perspective.
I don't want to put him on the spot, but
No. You guys are fine. I consider myself a student, and certainly of you three. You people, you guys are all, I've learned so much from you in my career over the years. So I was really enjoying listening. What it makes me think of, though, is, you know, I agree with everything everyone said, resonates very strongly. So why do we see such a lack of application of these things in organizational design? And I think Nigel touched on it with regard to incentive, but I'd love to hear your opinions with regard to like, yeah, why don't we see more application of this kind of thinking in the world? What's
Let me just
Possibly.
reply. Sorry, Dave, go ahead.
I was going to say possibly because you're trying to homogenize different statements. We actually have just profoundly disagreed with Andrea. And we need to understand that there's some science behind this stuff. So I don't disagree with the value of empathy, but I have profoundly disagreed with focusing on individual change as opposed to change in interactions over time and at scale, and the need for articulation of that. So there are some important differences. It's not mean there's not things in common, but there are important differences. And part of the reason nothing works in modern organizations is everybody wants a sort of happy, clappy, sweet, harmonious, we can all agree on things, rather than accepting there are some things we need to start to disagree on, and we need to start disagreeing on them fast if we're going to make progress.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And Dave, I don't think it's an either or. I agree that all of those things are also important. But I also think that individual empowerment, because people feel like they're a cog in the wheel and they have no power, they actually, if we're talking about spheres of influence, there's something they can do. So thinking about
Change the
motivation.
power.
Well, yes, that would
change
be a
the power
systemic thing.
dynamics.
And I definitely think that it works in tandem. It's not an either or. I think I've been really also influenced by Scott Page's work on the diversity bonus, which talks about how do we get innovation, right? And so we get innovation when people who have very different perspectives, a lot of cognitive diversity, are able to interact, and then they create new and novel ideas. So I would agree with you, Dave. The idea is not harmony, right? That's groupthink. That can be very dangerous, right? What we're looking for is the ability to leverage the different ways of interacting. It's optimizing information to reduce cognitive load, right? There's a lot of different things with both systems and individuals.
You get innovation when the existing method of operation can no longer sustain itself in the face of reality. And that forces people to dive deeper and think differently. One of the ways you can achieve that is to put people together from different perspectives, but it doesn't guarantee it. So again, I think we need to get, and again, I'm emphasizing the difference because this is a panel, so I've reserved the right to be more reasonable later. But again, you've got to stop emphasizing individual behavior and individual actions and focus on how do we change the dynamics of those interactions and not worry so much about what labels we give to what comes out of it, if it's shifting in the right direction. So acceptation, for example, which is the major source of innovation in human history, happens when somebody accidentally notices a side effect under conditions of stress. It very rarely comes from people coming together from different backgrounds and having conversations. It comes from isolated individuals who spot an anomaly. And I could give you loads of examples of that. So we need to think about how we need to systematically create anomalies which people pay attention to. And it's not about changing the behavior or changing the attitude. It's about changing the process and the interactions.
So I want to come back to that, Dave, because then it shouldn't be like, how do we change the organizational architectures? How do we design for those interactions that you're referring to? So
that's what architecture is about. What good architecture does is it create, whether it's physical architecture or IT architecture, it creates a space in which interactions happen with fast response mechanisms. It doesn't say in advance what those interactions should be or what their quality should be. Yeah, it creates fast feedback loops so you can respond very quickly when things work or don't work. Some of our work, for example, let's take software. We're now looking on crews, or that's role combinations. We're treating them as software objects in an object-oriented architecture. So you can have people objects and software objects, which have standardized input-output mechanisms with polymorphism and inheritance. And you can handle a 90% of a software system, which caused 10% of the grief, with human actors early in development, and then start to replace the human actors with automation downstream. That's an architectural solution. Yeah, you're changing the actors, you're changing the interactions, you're monitoring for what happens.
But to come back, it kind of ties back to to what I was asking, and I'm very curious about, because I love that thinking. It very much resonates. But how do we do that in the face of the overwhelming personal, individual interest of a lot of, that we find within these social systems? That to me seems like, I think it speaks to what Nigel, you referred to as incentive,
I was going to just throw in, you see, because I've started to become more cynical. I'm obviously catching Dave up in years, and so my cynicism
You've got a
levels.
long way to go, mate. Got a long way.
But the reality is, I go into a lot of these companies and organizations. I'm very fortunate to do that, and I'm grateful I get the opportunity to do that because that's what pays the bills. But I often stand up in front of them, and they just stare at me like deers in the headlights. I joke about the Peter Principle sometimes, and the audience can Google that. I'm not going to define it here, but there's a lot of people listening, listen to me, and they obviously listen to the rest of us at times that are clueless about what we're talking about. We use language, vocabulary, science theories, because we're very well studied and well versed in this. We've made the effort to study this, but the majority of people running organizations are not. And their focus is very simple: make the money for this month, this quarter. Yeah, very simple, very, very basic. And we go in there and start throwing, theories around, and let's just dynamically reteam the organization, as Suzanne was talking about earlier. Because of Conway's law, there are some papers out there now disputing Conway's law, by the way. So, but the point is this: you go out and say dynamically reteam. So I go into one of my clients, one of the divisions of 6,000 people, and I say, we're going to use dynamic reteaming. Can you imagine just the sheer chaos of that across the organization? This isn't a 100-person organization. This is a deeply complex group of companies with one division with 6,000 people in, and they've got a bunch of problems in delivering flow effectively. And when we talk about flow, let's not kid ourselves here. If you want to take, Goldratt's theory of constraints version of flow, it's about making money. That was the whole thing it was predicated on, where flow from a lean concept is about making more units per unit time, so we can increase the throughput of what we can make in a given period of time, where Goldratt was more focused on let's make money. And most companies are focused on that focus. Let's make money. How do we get more stuff out the door for less money in the same amount of time so we can make more money? And the gap between cost and revenue increases, so we make more of this thing called profit. Vanity is revenue, sanity is profit. So the thing is we've got to first of all accept that's a reality, and accept that most people in the system are incentivized to make that a reality. And so when we go in there and we start talking about change and improvement and improving the system and the way everybody works and behaves, and I preach distributed leadership, some stuff that Dave talks about as well in distributed leadership. So moving the decision making closer to the people doing the work. Dave Marquez turned the ship around, sort of clarity and competency and all this sort of stuff. Move the decision making closer to the information. It's all good stuff. It's fantastic stuff. But the reality of it is you've got these very broken organizations that are predicated on making this month or this quarter's numbers, and woe betide you if you don't make the numbers. One of my clients, I speak to the CEO, and she'll tell me what happens to CEOs in the group if they don't make those numbers that year. They're no longer CEOs.
Can we make a distinction between public sector and private sector, because they're different approaches? And I'm talking one of the major banks on Tuesday. And what I'm talking about there is how they better invest money in order to effectively regenerate economies, and that's at a European-wide level. And what we're going to be talking there is about how do you get people to self-assemble in teams and spend small amounts of money so you can see what will actually work before you invest any major funding. So you stop giving money to people who are good at applying for grants. You give money to people who can assemble across boundaries and do small things fast. Yeah. Now that is risk reduction. The one thing you see in common between industry and public sector at the moment, there are two things which sell: risk reduction, cost reduction. Yeah, they're not going to believe you as an external consultant that much on profit. They will you, Nigel, because you've been in that position. But for most people on this thing, you have to go in with a method and say, I can reduce your risk, I can reduce your cost. Yeah, and you need to have the theory behind it if they asked you, but you don't start off with that. So, for example, one of the things we do with estuarine mapping or affordance mapping is we measure the energy cost of change, the time to change, and we say what can't be changed. So we define the field in which you can make change anyway. That can save companies a fortune. It only takes 2.5 days to do. So again, you start to talk about really pragmatic things you can do. You don't talk about how people should be or how things should be. You talk about, well, you've got this issue, we can do something on it. And by the way, it's really based in sound theory. If you want to know, I'll explain it to you, but I don't have to. Yeah. And the
But
market
isn't
shifted
that
on.
like what you're just describing, Dave? Isn't that applying empathy and perspective taking? You're meeting those people where they are. In a sense, that's what's important
No,
to.
no, it isn't. Sorry, it isn't. Well, I mean, you're getting too artificial then, right? So, I mean, then empathy becomes a buzzword which applies to anything. I'm actually using empathy extensively because if people self-assemble in a small group of less than seven, that's actually a link to the size of the extended family where we naturally show empathy. I'm going to use empathy as one of the mechanisms, but I'm not going to make it explicit or make it the only thing I'm talking about. I'm going to
Correct.
say, look, know that people in groups of seven or less will compromise. In groups of seven or more, they won't. And here's the theory if you want it. So if we can get small groups to work together on small problems, then we can see what's viable in the situation, and we can measure that financially, not in terms of human behavior, because that will get attention.
Mhm.
I
But it is,
wonder,
sorry,
it,
go
Sorry.
ahead, Andrea.
my quote in the background, I perceive as potentially relevant here. Um, it's like what I've experienced is in a lot of these systems, this, for instance, consider standard HR practices, right? It's all about individual performance, comparing individual to individual. Merit ratings are based on this, right? So a lot of times when you want to optimize the whole, the performance of the system towards its goal requires some level of sub-optimization of the parts. And especially those who are in authority are certainly not willing to allow themselves to be quote unquote sub-optimized because then there's potentially a case their merit might suffer, their social status might suffer. And that seems like a huge hurdle. I have Bob Emiliani's done a lot of great work on it, but I don't know, just in my own subjective experience, that has been a focus, a significant hurdle as far as I can, I've perceived it. And I'm curious what others' reflections are on that.
The
I
team is
think some
the
of,
same thing as the
oh,
crew. Sorry, go on, Andrew.
yeah, so I think some of this comes down to, yes, empathy has been used as a buzzword, and that's a problem. And we don't understand it colloquially, right? And the problem is that, our common understanding of it doesn't align with the research. So when we approach empathy that is aligned with the research, what we're doing is we're optimizing exactly that. We're optimizing a subsystem within the broader system, right? And it's those systems, it's, functionally within our bodies. It is being able to regulate, it's being able to emotion share, it's being able to consider another person's perspective, and it's being motivated to improve well-being. And so that in itself is a system, both internally, and then also it impacts the context around you, impacts the capacity for that to occur. So I think that, I don't think we're disagreeing here. It's that, the way that we typically think about empathy as an emotion or as a behavior, it's not that. It's a capacity and it's a system within itself that can be optimized.
I think the key thing is to realize things are contextual. So the trouble is, and it's very true of Agile, everybody has a sort of pet thing they think is the most important. The reality in different contexts, they'll come together in different combinations. So there are actually times in leadership theory where you don't want a leader to exercise any empathy whatsoever. I'm working at the moment on end of life decisions for children. If the doctors had empathy for the child, they couldn't cope with the job, quite literally, right?
Yeah, I absolutely agree.
So,
And that's the
right?
optimizing the system. It's knowing
Well,
exactly in a
what I'm
technical
saying is,
capacity when to deploy each piece.
yeah, so the danger is what we're looking for is human qualities or individual human motivation. When the reality is that will be complex and it will change by context. And retrospectively, we'll be able to say, well, here they exhibited empathy, or here we changed the measurement system. But the way you change things at the time is not to start with the emergent properties. It's to start with the changes of who is acting, what are their interactions, how am I monitoring it? It's that simple. Yeah. And then empathy may be one of the things which comes out of that.
I'll throw something in while you're all contemplating that, and I agree with that, what you're all saying. I think the challenge with a lot of the industry and some of the people on this conference from the agile industry or the agile observers is that the agile industry all went out and told everybody what the problem was, how they were going to solve it. And I think that's a big problem for a lot of consulting organizations. We go in there thinking we know the answer to everything. We think we've got the toolkit to solve it. We state what the problem is. We state if you follow us, we'll solve the problem. I've taken some time, again, it's an age thing now and a cynicism thing, is I no longer try and solve problems for any organization. I'm not there to solve the problems. In fact, I don't know how to solve the problems. I'm clueless of how to solve the problems. What I can help them do is understand their system and understand the challenges that are emerging from that system. And I can help them understand ways they may be able to cope within that system to be able to affect, meaningful change. But I come back to the whole point is what is the intrinsic motivations of organizations to change? Because I've come from a Toyota world where change is seen as in the long term. Toyota do things that, are decades in the making sometimes, but they certainly look out many years in the future and the direction of travel they're going in. And Dave will talk about vector theory of change, what Toyota would call true north. That is just a direction today. It will change constantly and it will evolve and change depending on what emerges and what we learn and how the system reacts to the way the world is evolving and changing around it. But the challenge is that that most organizations I deal with don't see anything further than the next 90 days. Everything somebody was mentioning about goals in the chat, proximal and distal goals. Yes, we need distal goals of the organization that all the teams can align to. They're proximal goals, and if we want alignment, then we need to make sure everybody is rowing in the same direction and targeting the same vector theory, the direction we're going in, the correct vector, the change we're sort of trying to enable. But most of the time, the thinking is so short term that they make decisions now which fundamentally damage the organizations 12, 18 months, 2 years from now, because they're not permitted, they're not allowed to look beyond the next 90 days, which is when they've got to meet the appropriate targets. And these are the challenges that I see every single day in organizations. And these are the types of things that we need to talk about, and we need to find effective ways of managing. I'll come back to the sense making thing, and Dave knows I'm a huge proponent of sense making because it helps us understand the environment we're in. It helps us understand that these are the things that are driving the organization. It helps us reveal the risks and the challenges with following a certain strategy, and then helps us to have the right types of conversations around them. And to Andrea's point, yes, empathy's been overused. A lot of the DEI stuff has been overemphasized. Psychological safety. I mean, for goodness sake, even Amy Edmondson's offering certificates in psychological safety. It's just absolutely madness and complete bonkers. This stuff is emergent in the system, depending on those interactions, those behaviors, those attitudes within the system. And these are the sort of conversations we need to be having. Otherwise, we just keep, following the incentives flow. Oh, Dave's gone. He always goes at the most inopportune moments. But otherwise, we just keep following the same rhetoric we've been doing that goes over and over and over. And of course, the consulting industry will love it because we're all waiting now for what will replace agile for the next, mass adoption thing for the next 3 to 5 year cycle, and then we'll just rinse and repeat. I wonder actually if there's any way of solving this, and whether we could just keep adapting as consultants, make our money until retirement beckons, and then leave it to somebody else to worry about. Told you I was getting cynical.
So
Yeah,
maybe
you went right to the heart of it, though.
I want to do
the people make the real money in McKinsey's, all right? And the way McKinsey's make money is they run massive workshops and very expensive processes every 2 years where everybody agrees how wonderful it would be if they were XYZ company. But nobody is expected to change anything as a result of the McKinsey session. And that's become an industry. I mean, you could, the same is true on OD and HR. They've ended up with a Stockholm syndrome relationship with the CEOs. And CEOs know they won't get fired if they call in McKinsey's and implement a McKinsey's report because they won't be blamed for it. And I think breaking the big consultancies is something which is a mission which is worth going for. You can't change industry, but you might be able to break their models. Yeah.
So
my ribs are now hurting from chuckling at that last comment.
Well, I just want to maybe come back to this, and if this is related to Dave's closing keynote, but like we've spent a lot of 2 decades on agile movement, and a lot of what's been done has not changed much. And I think it still goes back to what do
No,
we
that's not true, Mijan. I mean, and sorry, I mean, I think Agile got several things wrong. One was to go down a proprietary commercial route. If you go back to DSDM,
yeah.
and I was one of the three founders of that, and that was one of the three inputs. We cooperated between competitors with open source methods. We didn't try and make a proprietary lock-in around training and certification. So I think that was wrong. But having said that, Agile has changed the way that people see software. It's no longer the fashion item, but it has achieved change. And the fads do achieve change. Business process re-engineering achieved change. It went too far with Six Sigma. Learning organization achieved change. These things do shift the environment. Yeah. And we need to recognize that, but be prepared to move on.
What I
I
mean is
wonder.
like systemic changes. What I mean is like, what Nigel alluded to is like until we change how we're funding, until we change how organizations are structured, even the whole concept of capitalism is driving a lot of these, uh, things that we see.
Okay, but let me give the worst possible example, all right? If you look at the Inner Development Goals, so this is trying to deal with global warming.
Yeah.
And Inner Development Goals really summarizes everything which is wrong with management consultancy in the commercial world. So they get 8,000 middle-class people together in Sweden to all agree that the world would be better if everybody thought like them, and nothing changes.
Yeah.
Right? And that's what we've been doing. Right? And until the dispositional state of the system, and that's the micro sacrifices that people make in a very localized environment, change people's attitudes so they will support 20-year programs rather than 2-year election cycles, it won't change.
Yeah,
It
and
doesn't
that's
mean
my argument of what empathy helps us do.
I do, and we're using empathy in that context, but it's not the only thing, right? And part of the problem you're trying to achieve there is in order to create what's called a substrate, you've got to stop talking about the big problem and start to interact at a hyper-local level and let the system itself change. So you need to be honest, the term systematic change is dangerous. The
Mhm.
term holistic thinking is fundamentally flawed and really dangerous. And we need to start to talk very differently about the way we allow systems to evolve. And some of that evolution may need to be triggered as drastic changes, but it's going to happen bottom up. It's not going to happen by a group of people agreeing how things should be.
I love that you said how we let systems evolve. It speaks to this idea that systems themselves have levels of agency,
Yeah,
groupthink.
we do. That's the whole
Yeah,
point of actor network theory and our work on constraints and constructors. The human actors actually often have less agency than the non-human actors.
I wonder, I often reflect, and this speaks to perhaps incentive or perhaps some sort of inflection point, but I often reflect on the economic impacts and on the of all of this, the detrimental economic impact. I mean, it seems massive to me, the opportunity to and the impact that could have if we were to create a more harmonious reality that it would have on the human condition. I'm curious.
But that won't happen. That was the whole game B nonsense in metamodernism. And it's the attempt to define the future. Yeah. What you've got to do is you've got to change the present. So, for example, gifting cultures generated in villages will have a bigger impact on capitalism than people getting together and talking about the end of it. Because gifting cultures change relationships, right? And until the day-to-day interactions of the people who vote for politicians change, or the day-to-day interactions of people who buy goods change, you won't change the bigger systems. As that, I mean, it's not a good lesson. It's a fundamental lesson of complexity science. That's how systems change. Now, whether we can change them in time then becomes an open question. But it's a mortal sin to give up hope. But I'm not required to be optimistic.
I'm going to throw in just, because I know we're getting close to time, Miljan, but, I have this, I don't know if it's thesis, a theory, just a mad idea that, we are, as humans, we are always striving to achieve greater things, to win, to succeed. And from birth, we teach our kids to beat the opposition, to win at all costs, whether it's in board games, in card games, in sports. There's no prize for losing, and all this nonsense about it's all about the taking part. I tell that to an Olympic gold medalist. It's not about the taking part, it's about winning the gold medal. And it's about succeeding. Then we go to school and we get the best grades. Then we go to university or college, and no longer is a bachelor's necessary. We now must have a master's, and hey, let's go for the PhD. And then in business, we find that we have to constantly achieve promotion, more money, or move sideways into another organization to get a better role. And so we're always striving to thrive, to try and do better by defeating somebody else. So I think there's a problem with the human condition that's just inherent, that actually makes it extremely difficult in organizations, these large complex societies that create in these 10, 20, 30,000 person organizations, that a lot of our waffling and theories and talking is all well and good, but the reality of it is most people in those systems are trying to survive, and they're all focused on thriving, doing better at whatever cost. And there are some nice people in there. They're not all, Elon Musk. They're not all assholes. There's some nice people in the system there. And never trust a billionaire socialist. I mean, I work with executives who earn $4 or $5 million a year. Trust me, they don't have a problem. They don't see the problem because they earn $4 or $5 million a year.
There haven't been any socialists in the States since the Wobblies were massacred. I mean, Obama was a right-wing conservative in European terms, all right? So, kind of get that right. But there's one thing we need to get ready for. I'm talking now at society level. I've just come back from Washington with long hours with depressed Democrats, all right? And one of the points I've been making to them is they believe focus groups, and they believe what people say. They're not looking at the substrate of people's day-to-day interactions. Yeah. So I'll be back in March dealing with that. But one of the things we're talking about, the current estimate is 80% probability that 30 to 50 million or maybe 20 billion people will die on one day of heat death in the next 5 to 10 years. All right. And whether is it going to be India, or is it going to be southern United States, or will it be in Indonesia? It's going to be one of them. Now, what is that going to do to industry, to government, and to people? The refugee crisis we're going to face in 10 years' time is unbelievable compared with what we're facing now. And what we're not doing is getting ready, because those sort of events do change the way people perceive the world. And we need systems in place ready for that.
And
Sorry,
I live in
I have to sit on the bloody think tank, so everybody else should suffer as well.
And I live in Texas, so I can't wait for that.
Yeah, you're a candidate.
Oh.
Actually, look, I've currently got you top of the list, because your electrical grid is so weak that actually when people load the air conditioner, it will break. And the temperature goes from 58 degrees to 51 degrees if you're overweight. So that's going to hit Texans as well.
So maybe we have 7 minutes at max before Dragan starts his talk. So I want to come back maybe to those more practical tools. So empathy, Dave, you mentioned, is one. Would storytelling be another tool? What are some of the practical things that you can share with participants as far as tools for those interactions? And
I'll do some of this in the keynote, but I mean, I said on a chat this morning, substrate comes before storytelling. If anybody's been formally trained in rhetoric, and I have been trained in rhetoric, you have to understand what your audience will take before you decide what to communicate to them. And what we now see in the storytelling movement is they're up front. They're not actually listening to the people before they communicate. So if the people don't do what they say, they think it's a failure of communication. It isn't. It's a failure to understand the substrate. So storytelling, less so. Hyperlocal interactions, role-based decision-making, not individual-based decision-making, which applies to all military environments, all civil defense environments. Building informal networks across the organization. I can show that radically reduces risk in a crisis, but doesn't manage things explicitly. I'll go through some of these in the keynote. There's lots of really practical things we can lay out and respond to problems that executives currently have. They don't need to understand the theory. 5 years ago, you were selling to early adopters. We're now selling to early majority. That's a different market. They now want solutions, not theory. I mean, the solutions have to be based on theory, but you sell off the solution, you don't sell off the theory.
Thank you. Got 5 minutes in three of you. So what are your...
Well, no, I mean, I echo everything Dave's saying. I think people understanding how to make sense of the environment, so I would definitely look into sense making. It's served me very well in the last few years. I was reading Julie's comment there about what's the recommendation given the level of cynicism about middle management. Look, the reality of it is you're in a system that, you know, you may or may not be able to influence or nudge. I think there's always opportunity in any system at any level to have ways to improve the lot of the people in the system within your sort of within your sphere of influence. And I think there are things you can do. One of my big clients, as I say, has been working very much on the 1% Kaizen, the sort of, you know, continuous improvement sort of, and forget all the buzzword bingo that's out there, just the reality of how can we find ways to improve the environment, the system that we're in, whether it's, you know, eliminating waste, improving productivity, creating innovation, all these types of things. There are things that people can do, and we shouldn't give up hope. That we do need to recognize that the complexity of the systems we're in. We do need to recognize the human factors, the human condition. We need to recognize the incentives, the realities of large corporations, especially in North America, but it's prevalent in many other countries in the Western world anyway. And even if you go to some of what we used to call the emerging nations now, which are doing very, very well, thank you very much, the behaviors are there just the same. I mean, it's exactly the same attitudes and behaviors we're seeing in companies in South America, in India, in parts of Asia. There's no difference. Is once you start to make success, that creates some of its own challenges, which drive some of these behaviors. So I think you've got to recognize that, understand that. Stop trying to, you know, come along with some magical pixie dust to solve all the problems you perceive that exist. And I think life becomes a little bit easier and more tolerable. And you can make whatever improvements and strides you can in your own context within your own world. And the rest of us will keep waffling like this for the next few years until we're too old to be bothered. And hopefully somebody might listen one day.
Andrea, what are the final thoughts maybe on what we've discussed so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think this has been a really great conversation. And, you know, I think systems are something that are hard to wrap your brain around, right? And I think also recognizing that, you know, one of the most fascinating studies that I saw was that actually teaching systems thinking improves empathy because it improves your ability to scenario plan. It improves your ability to think about possible futures. And, you know, to me, I think, you know, yes, there are so many different abstract things that in theories, like Dave was saying. I think one of the most practical things that we can give individuals is helping them improve their own capacity. And the context absolutely plays into that. But there still is, you know, an opportunity to regulate yourself, to you know, focus on compassion. If you think about like Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, right? Regardless of where the situation is, you know, holding true to that and then recognizing when it's appropriate to perspective take in somebody else's shoes, right? If they're, you know, if your safety is threatened or you have to make a very high stake decision, yeah. But recognizing the role that compassion and empathy play in all of this, I think is useful, but not the only thing.
Right. Thank you. And Ian, 1 minute.
Yeah, sure. That's just reflecting on some things that specifically Dave said something about sacrifice at the hyper local level. I've been reflecting a lot, and it kind of ties to this quote, right? And then how that ties into this idea, you know, that kind of Nigel was touching on of the human condition and everyone working for their own interests, their own, you know, that local optima, instead of perceiving themselves like, is the ant the organism, or is it the hive, right? The grouping of ants, the colony. Same with humans, right? So like I just had a reflection about that. These ideas of making these local sacrifices so that the colony can thrive, because you know, at the end of the day, it's one ship. If the ship goes down, doesn't matter how much money you have, you're not going to be living in orbit in some hyperspace station for very long, right? We're all in it together, and you know, so that was just my reflection based on some of the dialogue. Yeah.
Dave, you were shaking your head. Maybe just quick response, and then we're gonna move to Duggan.
You don't optimize the whole by optimizing the parts. In a complex system, the whole cannot be determined by the nature of the parts. The parts may be suboptimal to optimize the system as a whole. Yeah, and actual suboptimal behavior may be necessary for the system to optimize. Right, so we just need to be really careful on this because we keep falling back into the language of systems thinking and the language of sort of European rationality from the Enlightenment, and that's what got us into this mess. Those two in combination.